When blacksmith Samuel Fletcher desperately knocked on what he thought was the doctor's door at 4 a.m., clutching his feverish daughter, he never expected the woman who answered to whisper, "I've been waiting for you." But was Catherine Brennan talking about that desperate night, or something much deeper? The hammer fell silent in Samuel Fletcher's blacksmith shop as a child's cry pierced the Montana Territory night. Outside, Cedar Ridge slept under a blanket of stars, but inside the small room behind his forge, 3-year-old Lucy burned with fever that no amount of cool water could break. Samuel pressed his rough hand against his daughter's forehead and felt his heart sink. The heat radiating from her tiny body reminded him of the forge fires he worked with every day, but this fire threatened to take away the only family he had left. Her breathing came in short, sharp gasps that sounded nothing like the peaceful sighs she made when healthy. "Papa," Lucy whispered, her voice so small he had to lean close to hear. "It hurts." Those 2 words hit Samuel harder than any blow from his heaviest hammer. He had built this life in Cedar Ridge brick by brick, nail by nail, after his wife Mary died bringing Lucy into the world. For 3 years, he had been both father and mother, learning to braid hair with the same hands that shaped horseshoes, singing lullabies with a voice better suited for calling across the smithy yard. But tonight, all his strength meant nothing against the sickness taking hold of his little girl. Samuel gathered Lucy in his arms, wrapping her in the quilt Mary had sewn during her pregnancy. The fabric still held the faint smell of lavender from the sachets his wife had loved. As he stepped into the cold October air, the wind cut through his work shirt like a blade, but Lucy's fever made her feel like a burning coal against his chest. The main street of Cedar Ridge stretched before him, a row of wooden buildings that looked exactly alike in the darkness. Somewhere among them lived Dr. Morrison, the only man in town who might save Lucy's life. Samuel had been to the doctor's house once before, when Lucy had broken her arm falling from a fence. But that had been during daylight, when every building had its own clear shape and purpose. Now, in the hour before dawn, panic made every door look the same. Samuel's boots echoed on the wooden boardwalk as he hurried past the general store, the barber shop, and the small church where he took Lucy every Sunday. His breath came out in white puffs that disappeared as quickly as his hopes seemed to be fading. Lucy's head rolled against his shoulder, and he could feel her getting weaker with each step. "Stay with me, little bird," he whispered, using the pet name Mary had given their daughter. "Papa's going to find help." The first house he tried had no answer, despite his urgent knocking. The second belonged to the town drunk, who opened the door but could barely stand upright. At the third house, an angry voice yelled for him to go away and come back at a decent hour. Samuel felt tears freezing on his cheeks as he stood in the middle of the street, holding his dying daughter. The wind seemed to be getting stronger, cutting through his clothes and making Lucy shiver even in her fever. Above them, the stars looked cold and distant, offering no comfort to a desperate father who was running out of hope. Then he saw it, a warm light glowing in the window of a small house at the end of the street. Someone was awake. Someone might help. Samuel ran toward the light, his heart pounding so hard it seemed to echo his footsteps. Lucy's breathing had become so shallow, he could barely feel it against his neck. As he reached the door, he noticed the paint was fresh and the small garden in front was carefully tended, even this late in the season. His knock came out harder than he intended, the sound sharp enough to wake the dead. But he didn't care about being polite anymore. His daughter was slipping away, and this might be his last chance to save her. The door opened, and Samuel found himself looking at a woman with auburn hair hastily pinned up and green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a simple brown dress with a wool shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, but there was something in her face that made Samuel think of sunrise after the darkest night. "Please," he gasped before she could speak. "My daughter. She's burning up. I can't find the doctor." The woman's eyes moved to the bundle in his arms, and her expression changed from surprise to something Samuel couldn't quite name. For a moment that felt like forever, she stood perfectly still, studying Lucy's flushed face and hearing her labored breathing. Then she stepped back and opened the door wider. "Bring her inside," she said, and her voice carried a calm certainty that made Samuel's knees weak with relief. Quickly now. Catherine Brennan had been sitting by her window for over an hour, watching the empty street and thinking about ghosts. Not the kind that rattled chains or moaned in the walls, but the quieter ghosts that lived in the spaces between heartbeats. The memory of her husband's laugh, the echo of footsteps that would never come home again. She had given up trying to sleep after the dreams came again. Always the same dream. James walking through the door, hanging his hat on the peg by the entrance, calling her name the way he used to when he came home from his job at the mining office. In the dream, she would run to him, and he would sweep her up in his arms, and the past 2 years of loneliness would disappear like morning frost. Then she would wake up to an empty house and remember that James was buried in the cemetery on the hill, along with all their plans for children and growing old together. So she sat by the window instead, mending clothes by lamplight and watching the world sleep around her. It was during these quiet hours that she had first noticed the blacksmith, who walked past her house every morning on his way to work. He always carried himself with purpose, his shoulders straight despite whatever burden he carried. Sometimes she saw him with a little girl who skipped beside him, chattering in the way children do when the whole world feels magical. Catherine had never spoken to either of them, but she found herself looking forward to those brief glimpses of life continuing beyond her own small circle of grief. The desperate knocking at her door shattered the night's stillness like glass breaking. Catherine's first instinct was to pretend she hadn't heard it. Proper ladies didn't answer their doors to strangers in the dark hours before dawn. But the knocking came again, more urgent this time, and she heard something in it that spoke to the part of her that had spent 3 years nursing wounded soldiers during the war. When she opened the door and saw the blacksmith holding his unconscious daughter, Catherine felt time slow down the way it used to in the army hospital when a critically wounded soldier arrived. Her training from those terrible, necessary years kicked in before her mind had time to question or hesitate. "Set her on the sofa," Catherine said, leading Samuel into her small parlor. The room felt different with other people in it, warmer somehow, as if it had been waiting for voices other than her own. Lucy was small for 3 years old, with her father's dark hair but delicate features that must have come from her mother. Her cheeks burned red with fever, and her breathing was fast and shallow. Catherine placed her hand on the child's forehead and felt the dangerous heat that meant they were fighting against time. "What's her name?" Catherine asked, already moving toward her kitchen where she kept the supplies that had saved lives during the war. "Lucy," Samuel answered, and Catherine heard how the name caught in his throat. "Lucy," Catherine repeated softly, sitting beside the child and smoothing her damp hair back. Such a pretty name for such a brave girl. As Catherine worked, she felt Samuel watching her every movement. She prepared willow bark tea to bring down the fever, mixed cool water with vinegar for compresses, and arranged Lucy's small body so her breathing would come easier. Her hands moved with the confidence of someone who had learned to heal in places where doctors were too few and emergencies too many. "You know what you're doing," Samuel said quietly. "I was a nurse during the war," Catherine replied, wringing out a cloth in cool water. "In Virginia, mostly. I learned that fever is like fire, you have to respect it, but you don't have to let it win." She placed the compress on Lucy's forehead and watched as the child's breathing began to slow and deepen. It was a good sign, but they weren't safe yet. "She's going to be all right," Catherine said, and meant it. "But we need to keep the fever down through the night." Samuel sank into the chair across from her, and Catherine saw exhaustion hit him like a physical blow. His hands shook as he ran them through his dark hair, and she realized he had probably been caring for Lucy alone for days, maybe weeks. "I don't even know your name," Samuel said suddenly, as if just realizing they were strangers sharing the most intimate kind of trust. "Catherine Brennan," she replied, adjusting Lucy's blanket. "I live alone here, have for about 2 years now. I'm Samuel Fletcher. Lucy and we live above the blacksmith shop on Main Street." Catherine nodded. "I know. I've seen you walking to work." The admission felt bold, but something about this night had stripped away the usual barriers between people. Samuel looked surprised. "You have?" I noticed things from my window. Since my husband died, I find myself watching life happen instead of living it. The words came out more honestly than Catherine had intended, but the darkness and the urgency of caring for Lucy had created a space where normal rules didn't seem to apply. They sat in comfortable silence as Lucy's fever slowly began to break. Catherine changed the compress regularly and gave the child small sips of willow bark tea when she stirred. Samuel helped without being asked, anticipating what she needed before she had to say it. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Lucy opened her eyes for the first time in hours. Her gaze was clear and curious as she looked around the unfamiliar room. "Papa?" she whispered. "I'm here, little bird," Samuel said, moving to kneel beside the sofa. "This is Mrs. Brennan. She helped you feel better." Lucy turned her attention to Catherine with the serious consideration that only children can bring to studying adults. "You have pretty hair," she said finally. Catherine felt her heart do something it hadn't done in 2 years. It skipped with genuine joy. "Thank you, sweetheart. You're feeling much better, aren't you?" Lucy nodded and snuggled deeper into the quilt. Within minutes, she was sleeping again. But this time it was the peaceful sleep of healing rather than the dangerous unconsciousness of fever. Samuel stood slowly, as if his body had forgotten how to move without the weight of desperate fear. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. Catherine looked at this man who had stumbled into her lonely life carrying his sick child, and felt something shift inside her chest. "You don't need to thank me," she said quietly. "This is what people do for each other." But even as she said it, Catherine knew it wasn't true. In her 2 years of widowhood, no one had done anything like this for her. She had been polite company at church socials and the recipient of occasional casseroles when people remembered she existed, but no one had ever needed her the way Samuel and Lucy had needed her tonight. "I should get her home," Samuel said, but he made no move toward the door. "Let her sleep a little longer," Catherine suggested. "The fever could come back if we move her too soon." It was a reasonable medical suggestion, but Catherine knew she was also asking for a few more minutes of feeling useful, of having voices in her house that weren't echoes of memory. For the first time since James died, she had remembered what it felt like to be needed for something more important than herself. Samuel Fletcher discovered that kindness could be more dangerous than any wild animal when he started visiting Catherine Brennan's house every evening after work. What began as checking on Lucy's health had become something neither of them dared to name. 3 weeks had passed since that desperate night, and Lucy had recovered completely. She now ran around Catherine's small garden, chasing butterflies and picking the last flowers of autumn, while the adults sat on the front porch. Catherine had sewn Lucy a new dress from fabric she'd been saving, and the little girl wore it like armor against the world. "Tell me about the war again," Samuel said, settling into the wooden chair Catherine had brought outside for him. His blacksmith's hands, permanently stained with soot and calluses, looked strange holding the delicate teacup she always prepared for their visits. Catherine's fingers paused in their mending. "It wasn't the kind of thing people usually want to hear about." "I want to hear everything about you," Samuel said quietly, then felt his face grow warm at his own boldness. She looked up from her sewing, and Samuel caught something in her green eyes that made his heart race faster than any physical labor ever had. "I was 17 when I started nursing, younger than most girls who did that work. The hospitals in Virginia they were places where boys became men very quickly, and where girls like me learned that life is more fragile than anyone wants to believe." Lucy's laughter drifted across the garden as she discovered a caterpillar on a leaf. The sound made both adults smile, creating a bridge between the darkness Catherine remembered and the light they were building together. "I met James at one of those hospitals," Catherine continued. "He was a clerk, keeping records of supplies and medicine. He used to bring me books to read during my breaks. Poetry, mostly. He said if I was going to spend my days surrounded by suffering, I needed something beautiful to balance it out." Samuel felt a strange mix of gratitude and jealousy toward a man he had never met. Grateful because James had loved Catherine well enough to leave her with confidence in herself, but jealous because someone else had seen her worth first. "Do you miss him?" Samuel asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "Every day," Catherine said simply. But missing someone doesn't mean you stop living. James taught me that too. During the war, he used to say that the best way to honor the dead was to make sure their love didn't die with them. Samuel leaned forward in his chair. What do you think he would say about this? About us spending time together? Catherine set down her mending and looked directly at him. I think he would say that love isn't something you use up. It's something that grows when you share it. The words hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Samuel felt his chest tighten with feelings he hadn't experienced since Mary died. But before he could respond, Lucy came running up the porch steps with dirt on her new dress and a handful of dandelions. "Look what I found," she announced, thrusting the yellow flowers toward Catherine. "They're for you because you're pretty and nice and you make the best cookies in the whole world." Catherine accepted the wilted bouquet as if it were made of gold. "They're beautiful, sweetheart. Should we put them in water?" As Catherine and Lucy went inside to find a jar for the flowers, Samuel remained on the porch, staring at the mountains that surrounded Cedar Ridge. The peaks were already snow-capped, warning that winter would come early this year. He thought about the cold months ahead, about long evenings by his forge with only Lucy for company, and felt something close to panic at the idea of returning to his old life. When Catherine came back outside, Lucy had convinced her to braid her hair with ribbons. The sight of them together, his daughter and this woman who had appeared in their lives like an answer to a prayer he hadn't known he was praying, made Samuel's throat tight with emotion. "Catherine," he said, and her name felt different in his mouth now, more important somehow. "I need to tell you something." She settled back into her chair, giving him her full attention in the way that had first made him feel truly seen. "I haven't been the same since that night," Samuel began. "Not just because you helped Lucy, though that changed everything too, but because I forgot what it felt like to not be alone." Catherine's hands stilled in Lucy's hair. "Samuel, I know it's too soon," he rushed on. "I know people will talk, and I know you probably need more time. But I also know that life is short and sometimes the best things come when you're not looking for them." Lucy had gone very still, sensing the importance of the adult conversation happening above her head. Catherine's eyes never left Samuel's face as he struggled to find words for feelings that seemed too large for language. "What I'm trying to say is, I think I'm falling in love with you," Samuel finished quietly, "and I don't know what to do about it." The silence that followed felt enormous. A hawk cried somewhere in the distance, and the wind rustled through the cottonwood trees that lined Catherine's street. Samuel wondered if he had just destroyed the best thing that had happened to him in years. Then Catherine smiled, and it was like watching the sun rise after the longest night of winter. "I think," she said carefully, "that maybe we should stop pretending this is just about checking on Lucy's health." Samuel felt relief flood through him so powerfully that his hands shook. "So what do we do now?" Catherine looked down at Lucy, who was pretending not to listen while clearly hanging on every word. "Now we figure out how to be a family, if that's what you want." "More than anything," Samuel said, and meant it with every part of his heart. But neither of them noticed Mrs. Hutchins walking past on the other side of the street, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of their intimate conversation on the porch. Mrs. Evelyn Hutchins had built her reputation in Cedar Ridge on knowing everyone's business before they knew it themselves, and the sight of Samuel Fletcher holding hands with the widow Brennan on her front porch was the most scandalous thing she had witnessed in months. By Sunday morning, the news had spread through town faster than smoke from a prairie fire. Mrs. Hutchins made sure of it, stopping by every house between her own and the church to share what she called a matter of grave concern for our community's moral standards. "I saw them with my own eyes," she announced to Mrs. Patterson while they arranged flowers for the altar. Sitting together like an old married couple, and that child running around calling her Aunt Catherine, as if they were already family. "It's unseemly is what it is." Mrs. Patterson, who had always been kind to Catherine, frowned. "But surely there's nothing wrong with friendship. The poor woman has been alone for so long." "Friendship?" Mrs. Hutchins snorted. "Is that what they're calling it when a man spends every evening at an unmarried woman's house? When they sit on her porch for all the world to see, carrying on like sweethearts?" That's not friendship, Margaret. That's courting without proper supervision, and it reflects poorly on all of us. Samuel felt the change in town the moment he walked into Morrison's general store that Monday morning. Conversations stopped when he entered, and people who usually greeted him with friendly nods suddenly found their shoes very interesting. When he approached the counter to buy sugar for Lucy's breakfast, Mr. Morrison's usual smile was nowhere to be found. "Morning, Morrison," Samuel said, setting his money on the wooden counter. "Fletcher." The storekeeper's voice was cooler than the October air. "I hear you've been keeping unusual company lately." Samuel's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you mean." "Course you don't." Morrison bagged the sugar with more force than necessary. "Just seems to me a man with a young daughter to raise might want to be more careful about the example he sets. People talk, you know." "Let them talk," Samuel replied evenly, though his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Easy enough to say when it's not your reputation suffering," Morrison said. "But Mrs. Brennan's a respectable widow. She doesn't deserve to have her good name dragged through the mud because you can't conduct your affairs properly." Samuel left the store with his purchases and a burning anger that made him want to hit something. But as he walked toward his smithy, he noticed other changes too. Customers who usually stopped by with work were nowhere to be seen. The pile of horseshoes he'd made for the livery stable still sat untouched where he'd left them 3 days ago. By the time he reached his forge, Samuel understood that Mrs. Hutchins hadn't just attacked his reputation. She had threatened his livelihood. Meanwhile, Catherine faced her own battles at the dressmaker's shop, where she did piecework to earn money. Mrs. Collins, the shop owner, met her at the door with a tight expression and a bundle of unfinished work. "I'm sorry, Catherine," Mrs. Collins said, not sounding sorry at all. "But I can't have you working here anymore. Some of my customers have expressed concerns about your recent behavior. I can't afford to lose their business." Catherine felt the words hit her like physical blows. "My behavior? I helped a sick child. How is that wrong?" "It's not about the child, dear," Mrs. Collins replied in the tone people use when they're about to say something cruel while pretending to be kind. "It's about the appearance of impropriety. A woman in your position needs to be above suspicion. And frankly, entertaining gentlemen callers every evening doesn't look proper." "He's not a gentleman caller," Catherine protested. He's. But she couldn't finish the sentence because she didn't have words for what Samuel was becoming to her. More than a friend, but not yet officially anything else. In the space between those definitions, Mrs. Hutchins had found room to plant doubt and judgment. Catherine walked home with her dignity intact but her future uncertain. Without the income from sewing, she would have to find another way to survive. And in a town where reputation mattered more than truth, that was becoming harder every day. That evening, Samuel arrived at Catherine's house to find her sitting on her porch steps instead of in her usual chair. Lucy ran to greet him as always, but Catherine's smile seemed forced. "What's wrong?" Samuel asked, settling beside her on the steps. "Mrs. Collins let me go today," Catherine said quietly. "She said my reputation was affecting her business." Samuel felt rage build in his chest like steam in a kettle. "This is my fault. I should have been more careful, more." "More what?" Catherine interrupted. "More secretive? More ashamed of caring about someone?" "No," Samuel said firmly. "But maybe I should have thought about how this would affect you before Before you what? Before you saved my life by giving me something to care about again." Catherine turned to face him fully. "Samuel, I was dying in this house. Not physically, but inside where it counts. You and Lucy brought me back to life. I won't apologize for that, no matter what Mrs. Hutchins thinks." Lucy, who had been playing nearby, suddenly ran over and climbed into Catherine's lap. "Why are you sad, Aunt Catherine? Did someone hurt your feelings?" Catherine hugged the little girl close. "Sometimes grown-ups make things more complicated than they need to be. Sweetheart, are you going to stop being our friend because of the mean people?" Lucy asked with the directness that only children possess. Catherine looked at Samuel over Lucy's head, and he saw determination replace the sadness in her green eyes. "No, little bird. I'm not going anywhere." But as Samuel walked home that night, he wondered how long their resolve would last against a town determined to tear them apart. The confrontation that would change everything started with a child's innocent question in the middle of Cedar Ridge's busiest street. Lucy tugged on Catherine's skirt as they walked past the post office and asked loudly enough for half the town to hear, "When are you going to marry my papa and be my real mama?" Mrs. Hutchins, who had been waiting for exactly this kind of moment, stepped directly into their path like a mountain blocking a river. Her black dress and stern expression made her look like a judge ready to pass sentence on the guilty. "Well, well," Mrs. Hutchins said, her voice carrying across the wooden boardwalk to where other townspeople had stopped to watch. "I suppose the child knows what the adults are too dishonest to admit." Catherine felt Lucy press closer to her side, confused by the anger in the woman's voice. "Mrs. Hutchins," Catherine said carefully, "Lucy is just a little girl. She doesn't understand." "Oh, I think she understands perfectly," Mrs. Hutchins interrupted, her words sharp as broken glass. "Children always know when something shameful is happening in their lives. Poor thing probably thinks it's normal for her father to spend his nights at an unmarried woman's house." A small crowd had gathered now, drawn by the raised voices and the promise of drama. Catherine recognized faces from church, from the general store, from the quiet life she had tried to rebuild after James died. Some looked uncomfortable with Mrs. Hutchins' attack, but none stepped forward to defend her. "That's enough," Catherine said, her nurse's training helping her keep her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. "Lucy, why don't you go look at the pretty ribbons in Mrs. Patterson's shop window?" But Lucy, with the stubbornness she had inherited from her father, planted her feet firmly on the boardwalk. "You're being mean to Aunt Catherine," she announced to Mrs. Hutchins. "Papa says mean people are just scared people who forgot how to be nice." Mrs. Hutchins' face turned red as a sunset. "How dare you allow that child to speak to her elders with such disrespect? This is exactly what I mean about improper influence. A decent woman would teach children proper manners, not encourage them to be sassy." "Lucy has excellent manners," Catherine replied, her voice growing stronger. "She also has a loving heart and the courage to defend people she cares about. If you see those as faults, then perhaps the problem isn't with her upbringing." The crowd murmured at Catherine's bold response. Mrs. Hutchins had expected shame and apologies, not defiance from the quiet widow who usually kept to herself. "The problem," Mrs. Hutchins said, stepping closer until Catherine could smell the lavender soap she used, "is that you've forgotten your place. A proper widow mourns her husband respectfully and doesn't go chasing after the first man who pays her attention." That's when Samuel's voice cut through the tension like an axe through wood. "Step away from them. Now." Everyone turned to see Samuel Fletcher striding down the street, still wearing his leather apron from the forge. Coal dust streaked his face and arms, but his dark eyes burned with a fury that made even Mrs. Hutchins take a step backward. "Samuel Fletcher," Mrs. Hutchins said, trying to regain her commanding tone. "How convenient of you to arrive. We were just discussing your arrangement with Mrs. Brennan." Samuel moved to stand between Mrs. Hutchins and Catherine, his broad shoulders blocking the older woman's view of them. "There's nothing to discuss. Catherine helped save my daughter's life, and if you have a problem with me being grateful for that, you can take it up with me directly." "Grateful?" Mrs. Hutchins laughed, but the sound held no humor. "Is that what you call spending every evening at her house? Is that what you call letting your child get attached to a woman who isn't her mother?" Samuel's hands clenched into fists, and Catherine saw the moment when his careful control began to crack. "My daughter's mother died bringing her into this world," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "If Lucy has found someone else to love, someone who loves her back, then I thank God for that blessing instead of looking for reasons to destroy it." "You thank God?" Mrs. Hutchins' voice rose to a pitch that made several people wince. "You think God approves of unmarried people carrying on like husband and wife? You think he smiles on scandal and impropriety?" "I think," Samuel said, stepping closer to Mrs. Hutchins until she had to crane her neck to look up at him. That God cares more about love and kindness than he does about the opinions of bitter women who have nothing better to do than spread poison about their neighbors. The crowd gasped at Samuel's directness. No one had ever spoken to Mrs. Hutchins like that, not in all her years of ruling Cedar Ridge's social order through fear and judgment. Mrs. Hutchins' face went white, then red, then white again. How dare you? I am a pillar of this community, a founding member of the Ladies' Auxiliary. You're a bully? Lucy piped up from behind Catherine's skirts. My papa taught me about bullies. They try to make other people small because they feel small inside. The silence that followed Lucy's words was so complete that Catherine could hear the wind rustling through the cottonwood trees at the end of the street. Mrs. Hutchins stared down at the 3-year-old who had just delivered the most devastating blow of the entire confrontation. This child, Mrs. Hutchins said slowly, needs to learn respect for her betters. This child, Samuel replied, scooping Lucy up into his arms, needs to learn that she doesn't have to make herself small to make other people comfortable. She needs to learn that love is something to celebrate, not hide. He turned to address the crowd that had gathered around them. Catherine Brennan saved my daughter's life. She opened her door to strangers in the middle of the night and asked for nothing in return. She has shown Lucy more kindness in the past month than some people show in a lifetime. If anyone in this town has a problem with me caring about a woman like that, then you're welcome to take your business elsewhere. With that, Samuel offered his arm to Catherine. Walk with me. Catherine took his arm, feeling the strength in it and the slight tremor that betrayed how much this confrontation had cost him. Together, with Lucy between them, they walked down the main street of Cedar Ridge while the town watched in stunned silence. Behind them, Mrs. Hutchins stood alone on the boardwalk, her authority cracked like ice in spring. But Catherine knew the battle was far from over. Winter arrived in Cedar Ridge 3 weeks early, blanketing the town in snow that muffled sounds and made every building look like a picture from a fairy tale. Inside Catherine's warm kitchen, Samuel proposed marriage while she rolled out biscuits for breakfast, and Lucy built a castle from wooden blocks on the floor. I know it's not romantic, Samuel said, flour dusting his hands as he helped knead the dough. I know I should have flowers and a fancy speech prepared, but I also know that life doesn't always wait for perfect moments. Catherine stopped rolling and looked at him, really looked at him. Snow sparkled in his dark hair from the walk over, and his eyes held the same mixture of hope and fear she felt in her own heart. Are you asking because you love me, or because the town expects it now? Because I can't imagine my life without you in it, Samuel said simply. Because Lucy needs a mother who already loves her like her own. Because when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I think about is seeing your smile. Lucy looked up from her blocks. Are you going to kiss now? Married people always kiss in the stories. Catherine laughed, the sound bright as silver bells in the cozy kitchen. What do you think, little bird? Should I marry your papa? Yes. Lucy jumped up and threw her arms around both adults. Then we can live in the same house, and you can make pancakes every morning and read me stories every night, and we'll be a real family. Samuel looked at Catherine over Lucy's head. Is that a yes? That's a yes, Catherine whispered. And when he kissed her, it tasted like flower and hope and the promise of spring after the longest winter. But their happiness was interrupted by urgent knocking at the front door. Samuel opened it to find Dr. Morrison, the town's physician, standing in the swirling snow with his medical bag and a grim expression. Fletcher, thank God you're here, Dr. Morrison said, stepping inside and stamping snow off his boots. There's been an accident at the mine. Cave-in trapped 6 men, and 2 are hurt bad. I need every pair of skilled hands I can get. Samuel was already reaching for his coat. What do you need me to do? Help dig them out, and then help me carry the wounded back to town. Mrs. Brennan, he turned to Catherine. I heard you were a nurse during the war. Would you be willing to assist? Catherine felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with medical emergencies, but she nodded without hesitation. Of course. Lucy, you'll need to stay with Mrs. Patterson while we help the hurt people. As they prepared to leave, Samuel caught Catherine's hand. Are you sure about this? could be dangerous. I'm sure, Catherine said, tying her cloak around her shoulders. This is what we do for our neighbors. This is what we do for our community. The mine was 2 miles outside town, and the ride through the snow-covered countryside gave Catherine time to prepare mentally for what they might find. Samuel drove the wagon while Dr. Morrison explained the situation. A support beam had cracked, bringing down part of the tunnel ceiling. Most of the men had escaped, but 6 were still trapped, and at least 2 were seriously injured. When they arrived at the mine, Catherine saw a crowd of worried families gathered around the entrance. Women held crying children, and men paced back and forth, their faces tight with fear for their friends still underground. "Catherine," Mrs. Patterson called out, surprise clear in her voice. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Dr. Morrison asked for my help," Catherine replied, already unpacking medical supplies from the doctor's bag. As they worked through the day, digging carefully to avoid further cave-ins, Catherine found herself working alongside people who had shunned her just weeks before. Mrs. Collins held bandages while Catherine cleaned wounds. Mr. Morrison from the general store helped carry stretchers. Even some of Mrs. Hutchins' closest friends worked beside her without complaint. When the last injured miner was brought to the surface, his leg broken but his life intact, Catherine realized something had changed. The same people who had whispered about her reputation were now thanking her for her skill and dedication. "You saved my husband's life," Mrs. Weber said, tears streaming down her face as Catherine finished splinting her husband's arm. "I'll never forget that." Samuel, covered in coal dust and exhaustion, watched as person after person approached Catherine with gratitude and respect. This was the woman he was going to marry, someone who put service before self, who answered calls for help regardless of personal cost. As they rode back to town in the gathering dusk, Dr. Morrison cleared his throat. "Mrs. Brennan, I've been thinking. This town needs another trained medical professional. Would you consider working with me? Officially, as a partner." Catherine felt Samuel's hand squeeze hers in the darkness of the wagon. Yes, I'd like that very much." When they reached Cedar Ridge, news of Catherine's heroism had already spread. People who had avoided her for weeks now nodded respectfully as she passed. Children who had been forbidden to speak to her waved from windows. But the biggest surprise waited at Catherine's house, where Mrs. Hutchins stood on the front porch holding a covered dish and wearing an expression that might have been humility. "Mrs. Brennan," she said stiffly, "I brought you some soup. I heard you've had a long day." Catherine studied the older woman's face, looking for signs of the anger and judgment that had defined their last encounter. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like shame. "Thank you," Catherine said carefully. "That's very kind." Mrs. Hutchins nodded and turned to go, then stopped. "My nephew was one of the men you helped today, Tom Weber. His wife says you probably saved his arm, maybe his life." "Dr. Morrison did most of the work," Catherine replied. "I just assisted." "No," Mrs. Hutchins said firmly. "You did more than that. You showed up when people needed you, even after the way some of us treated you." She paused, struggling with words. "That takes character." As Mrs. Hutchins walked away through the snow, Samuel pulled Catherine close. "I think the tide is turning." "I think," Catherine said, watching their neighbor disappear into the winter evening, "that maybe people just needed to see who we really are instead of who they assumed we were." That night, as they sat by Catherine's fireplace with Lucy asleep between them, Samuel spoke the words that would become the foundation of their marriage. "We're going to be all right, aren't we?" Catherine looked at the man who had knocked on her door in desperation and stayed to build a life, at the child who had called her Aunt Catherine before she had any official right to the title, at the home they had created together out of nothing but hope and determination. "Yes," she said, meaning it with every part of her heart. "We're going to be better than all right. We're going to be happy." Outside, snow continued to fall on Cedar Ridge, covering the town in the pure white of new beginnings.